Hello, I'm Tamar Sharon. I'm an associate professor of philosophy of technology at Radboud University. This is José van Dijck, professor of media studies at Utrecht University. And we're here today at a nice fireside chat to discuss...
Without a fire.
Without the fire.
We could put a screen here with a nice fire on it to make it, more calm. Very nice. Would be very nice.
Talk about platform utilities. Yeah. So we're here to discuss your new book, Platform Society, Public Values in a Connective World, which you've co-authored also with Thomas Poole and Martijn de Waal. And this bookcast or fireside chat is part of a special theme issue for Big Data and Society, which looks at how the health data ecosystem is expanding to include, new types of data, new means of collecting and analyzing data, and also new stakeholders like the platform actors who you discuss in the book. Okay, so thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure.
I'd like to start off with discussing, the main claim of the book, really. In a nutshell, that we live in a society where social, economic, and political interactions are increasingly being mediated by a global, overwhelmingly corporate online platform ecosystem. And the core problem that you identify in the book is that the architecture of this platform is not neutral. It's infused with norms and values which are in tension with the public values that are engraved, say, in existing societal arrangements.
Right.
So could you speak first just a little as to what you mean by public values and which are the public values that you find are most at stake in the implementation of platforms?
Right. Well, that's a big question in the book, of course. Public values are not values that you can buy off the shelf. You cannot go to a store and buy public values, but they're very important in our society. Now, that platform ecosystem that has expanded over the past 2 decades, as you mentioned, is completely commercial, it's corporate, and public values weren't its prime aim when it was designed, when its architecture was designed, and of course that architecture changed over the years. In our society, and particularly I think in European societies, we are currently facing a situation where the platform architecture and most of the platforms are being imported in our society from an American ideological system, which is mostly based on libertarian or market liberal values, and that is imported. And on that ecosystem, we are building a social democratic society where public values in Europe are a bit different than in the United States, for instance, in terms of privacy or security, but also in terms of transparency. Those are all, public values that we value a bit more in Europe than, they're mostly valued in the United States. And those are just the values that pertain to the internet as such, the platforms that we're constantly using. There's also a set of values that pertains to society as a whole. Think about not just privacy and security and transparency, but democratic control. The whole idea with fake news now is that we're valuing certain values are not anchored in that platform ecosystem that we have imported, but we're starting to to realize that those values did not come with that architecture. So we have to anchor them one way or another. Now, I just mentioned you cannot buy them off the shelf. So there's a constant negotiation process between users and platform companies about those public values. And that contest, that negotiation that's constantly going on, that's actually what the book is about. Yeah. How does that happen? How can we secure public values in an online world? Yeah. And that's not something that is stable, it's dynamic, it constantly changes, and it also involves some sort of, negotiations always involve a dynamic between various public values. You can sometimes trade privacy for security, but you also have to deal with democratic control, with transparency. So that's, the constant tension between the trade-off between those values.
Yeah. And one of the means I think that you've articulated this tension between, say, platform values and public values, and this kind of runs throughout the book, is between collectivity and connectivity.
Right.
So you're saying that connectivity does not necessarily entail collectivity. It might even undermine collectivity. It might even break down existing collectivities. Could you say a little bit more about this?
Yeah, that's one of my sort of provocative theses, is that, you know, connectivity is something different than collectivity. Yeah. What I mean by that is that connective platforms, what they do is simply connect users to people who want to offer a service, and you know, existing entities. You know, that's what platforms do. They connect.
Yeah.
That's what we call the multi-sided platforms.
Yeah.
Now, connectivity, the prime aim of online connectivity is to get to generate data, and in that way to monetize those data flows. So that's the prime aim of online connectivity. Collectivity is something, of course, we have known for ages. You know, we've come together as groups. Connecting is not something that you can only do online. On the contrary, we've been doing that, you know, for a long time. And collectivity is all about gathering with people to pursue a common goal. You know, to, for instance, a patient group, you know, a patient experience exchange. You do that, you come together because you want to exchange experiences. If you go into a connective world where connective platforms have as their prime aim to generate data, the prime aim is not to connect those people together, you know, which they would do by themselves, but the prime aim is to make them generate data for some kind of purpose. Oftentimes that purpose is very selective, or it's very short term. Whereas collectivity, of course, is based on a societal organization that is underpinned, undergirded by organizations, by institutions, by you know, schools, hospitals. That's also why we call it the platform society. This is not just about an economy of platforms, where platforms are now determining how our economy is, how transactions are taking place, but it's about much more. We have taken that corporate platform infrastructure and built on it a society that is also partly undergirded by collectivity. And then, of course, a lot of platforms tend to undermine that collectivity, because platforms like Uber, they skip basically the old taxi companies. Yeah. Schools, for instance, you no longer, if Google wants to sell educational software, it just goes to teachers or to individual students. Schools have nothing to do with that. So any type of collectivity that's in between a platform company and a user may well be bypassed in this system.
Yes. Yeah. And well, this observation, it really runs counter to the assumption that we had, say, in the early days of the internet, that participatory online practices would lead to more collectivity. It's
absolutely.
It's a bit the hangover of the night before. We're waking up to a very bleak reality here.
You know, that was the utopian vision of the internet. The internet, by nature of its design, by nature of its technological means, would connect people, but connecting is not the same as building a collectivity or building a common ground or building an organization. Yeah. So that's, I think, one part of the connective world that we have constantly underestimated and are still underestimating. To what extent these technological steerings of these mechanisms are not simply by themselves contributing to all kinds of collective organizations that we have built in society, but may also undermine it. Yeah. For instance, think about fake news. You know, the whole issue that news can now do without the distribution channels of news organizations, which were institutions, which are still institutions in our society, that are have also built-in values like transparency or control, and they can now easily be bypassed. And those public values are not built into that, you know, connective infrastructure.
Yeah. Okay. So in the book, you and your co-authors, you focus on 4 sectors. Could you say a little bit about these sectors and why you chose actually those specific ones?
It was actually very difficult to choose sectors because platforms are important in pretty much every sector, you know, across society. There's no sector that, you know, that platforms do not have an influence. We have selected 4 sectors, 2 private and 2 public sectors. The private sectors are news and public transport. I say public transport, but it's mostly private transport, transport, urban transport. And the public sectors are education and health. And the reason why we did that is in that platform society, pretty much all platforms appear to be equal, but they're not equal. We still have, especially in European societies, we have a difference. We make a distinction between the private sector and the public sector. In the public sector, let's take education and health, we very much value, for instance, fairness, accessibility of healthcare, fairness in education. We value transparency and privacy very much in terms of in the health context. So particularly in the public sectors, I think we need to be extremely precise as to what public values are still guarded and are still anchored in a platform society and which are not. And that's what I call the contest about public values, particularly in those public sectors.
Yeah. Now, our special issue is mostly related to health data, so I'd like to focus a little bit on the health sector, which was the focus of chapter 5, I think, in your book. You did a very nice analysis of that. So what does the platformization of health entail? Can you describe it a little bit? What do you mean by that?
It means several things, but platformization means that pretty much all the actions or transactions that you do in daily life are platformized, are now currently being transformed into an online context or transferred to an online context. Let's say patient experience, exchanging patient experiences. Now you have a zillion online groups where you as a patient can connect, for instance, to other patients with the same disease. So there's an Alzheimer's group, there's Parkinson's disease, there's all kinds of patient exchanges groups. So in an online situation, you don't know those people, but you connect to them because you want to exchange experiences. But the prime aim of most of these connective platforms, at least if they're for-profit platforms, is to gather data, to organize data in particular flows. There, in terms of health and fitness, there's a zillion fitness apps right now. If it's about, counting your steps or your heartbeat or your blood pressure, everything, pretty much, if you have your phone, built into your phone, are a number of platforms basically that can do that counting for you, and they're all automated. So basically what they do is 2 things. They transfer every movement into data, so it becomes a data flow, whether we talk about disease or whether you count your steps through the phone. And the other thing is that you can monetize those data. Once you have those data, you can turn them into a business model. You do not have to do that, but pretty much the entire platform ecosystem is based on monetization of data flows.
So this is really what would be, I think, something that's novel to the platformization of health in this current form. So public-private collaborations in healthcare and medical research are not new. Of course, Big Pharma comes to mind, and patenting practices. But there is something particularly new about this moment where, in the way that the health and medical sector kind of are interwoven with the infrastructure of the platform ecosystem, which makes this quite novel, I think.
Absolutely, and I think a very interesting example of that is the NHS case in London, which played out several years ago, and with DeepMind. So I think it was 2015 when the London NHS hospitals, which are public hospitals, they exchanged 5 years worth of personal private data, patient data, with DeepMind. DeepMind is a subsidiary of Google. And in exchange for that, in exchange for those data, they would provide health analytics. Or actually they would develop health analytics that would allow DeepMind to develop certain services for particular patient groups. Now this is a trade-off between public hospitals and a private company, which is pretty much about data flows. The short-term interests of public hospitals, of course, is if they they get those services for free, and they give away the data in order to, in exchange for very interesting and very helpful data analytics, often to be used in personalized healthcare, which is of course a big issue. And there's tremendous opportunities in personalized healthcare. The other side of that is twofold. What happens to the privacy of these data? That's a very important question. But another, public value that is exchanged here is what happens to getting access to those data in the long term. Because once Google DeepMind in this case, well, it's part of Google now.
They've just now actually
said it. I was just going to say that, but now they've actually said, well, the data are Google's. The data are not simply DeepMind, and they promised they would be part of DeepMind. So that's another question. But that's part 2 of that story. Yes. So what happened there is that we have traded basically short-term interests for long-term data access. And once you do that, you cannot go back. So in a way, it's very much parallel to what the big pharma industry does with, taking charge of certain pharmaceutical remedies. And in the long run, it's really to the detriment of a public value that those data become proprietary. So rather than keeping them open, keeping them accessible, keeping them cheap for everyone who wants to use them, they're now becoming a proprietary asset. And that's what happens to a lot of data flows in this system. They're becoming proprietary assets. On top of that, there's even a larger societal issue, which is that Google does not just own health data, they also own educational data, they also own traffic data. There's practically no sector in society that Google does not have, is not a very major player in data ownership. And behind the screen, what Google does, of course, is to use the cross-linking between those data flows to become an even more powerful player, because a lot of AI, a lot of artificial intelligence technology of the future is fed by those data flows. So if you don't have access to those data flows, you cannot develop artificial intelligence. So it's both a very small question, like what is the trade-off of public values between NHS hospitals and the big actor here, Google, but it's also a social issue, and it becomes even a geopolitical issue if you see that in terms of what's going to happen to our data flows in the near future, like 5 years from now or 10 years from now.
Yeah, and these say higher levels of the impact of this is not necessarily something that the people working at the NHS who are benefiting right now from the app that's been developed using that data are thinking about, but they were the ones making the decisions about allowing access to these data sets, so these decisions certainly need to be made at a different level.
Absolutely.
Understanding these different levels of impact.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, I would like to move a little bit from just the health sector to ask you a question about what I see as one of the really great contributions of this book, and that's to contribute to kind of laying bare the functioning of platforms. So there's a strong claim here as to the importance of understanding the material and technical functioning of platforms. This is really a strong point you make. It's a very kind of STS-y approach to things. So could you describe a little bit of this technical functionality of the platform ecosystem?
Well, the problem of explaining the technicalities of the platform ecosystem is that it's so complicated.
Yes.
So I can't just explain it in 2 sentences. I've used a couple of visuals in the book that I think will be very helpful. Yeah. But one of the major aims to explain the technicalities and the complexity of that system is to show regulators that it's important to understand how it works, to understand the architecture. If you don't understand that, you cannot design regulation. Now, I think the most important part there is that when regulators or whoever governs the digital society looks at platforms, they usually say, well, all platforms are equal. Whoever can start a platform and they're all equal. Well, that's problematic. They're not equal. Not all platforms are equal. Some are more equal than others. And what I call, what I call infrastructural platforms are those platforms that have power across different sectors. Most platforms like Uber or Airbnb, they focus on a single sector, either hospitality or transport, but there's a couple of platforms, and the big five, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon and Microsoft, they're in charge of some 80 to 100 infrastructural platforms. What are infrastructural platforms? For instance, social networking. Facebook is the big proprietary social network servicer. Cloud services, pay services, identification services. We have app stores. App stores are bottlenecks in the entire platform ecosystem. So we identified, a number, some 80 infrastructural platform services. The idea of those services is that you just need one single ID to go to all different services, across the cross-linking, and that's why those infrastructural services are so crucial to getting access to the ecosystem as a whole. They're all proprietary. There's no public services in those infrastructure, and they're vital to connect different data flows from different sectors. Moreover, all of our legislative and regulatory frameworks are based on sectors. So if you want to regulate society, you usually go to a sector and you say, okay, if you want to organize this sector, you need to comply with these and these and these public values, right? Now, the problem with these big five companies who have both infrastructural and sectoral platforms is that they can cross-link and they can go between and across and link those various data flows over which a society almost has no control, because all of their frameworks are based on differentiated infrastructural and sectoral platforms. So that's why I think it's so important to understand the technicalities of this system and the dynamics of the system. Once you understand how it works, you can change your regulatory frameworks. If you don't, it's very hard to make any regulation at all.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. I'd like to turn to a bit of a different issue now, and that is about what can be done really to redesign platform society in such a way that it's anchored in public values. So I think the book can also be read as a short practical guide actually towards this task, or at least a preliminary guide to this. Now, you distinguish three types of actors who have responsibility, who should be working together to help build a new platform society, which would be more accountable and balanced and fair. So you mention industry, civil society, and government as all involved. But you give a greater share of responsibility to governments. Why is that?
Well, it's not, I think, no misunderstandings. I think everyone is equally responsible for the platform society. We're all involved in arranging that new platform society. So we all have responsibility. The reason why I think governments are more important is, first, they haven't been very much involved so far. They have pretty much said, well, we'll leave that to markets. And that, all platforms that's a market issue. Market can take care of itself. That's, of course, a very neoliberal, but also a very libertarian almost argument, which is very dominant in the United States. In Europe, because we have, we care very much about public sectors, we care very much about public values, I think we have an obligation here in Europe as governments to play a special role. If we just leave markets if we leave the whole platform society to markets, there will be, at one point, you will realize, okay, we have accepted that complete ideology and adapted the society to a technological architecture. I think it should be the other way around, and in that respect, I think governments have a special responsibility.
Yes, yeah. I feel a bit skeptic about that. I mean, at least I think we're in a bit of a paradoxical situation, because on the one hand, as you explained very nicely in the book, the development of the current platform society has thrived in quite a specific political economy, whereby governments, including European ones, have enabled kind of the construction of this current platform society by allowing for a penetration of market rationalities and principles into various social activities. So governments have enabled this. On the other hand, we want to turn to them to ask them to help better govern and control this. So I think perhaps the book can be read also as a greater plea for a different kind of government,
Right.
one that is not as, we might call it, neoliberal as what we've had
Right.
so far. That would be the kind of government that we could turn to
Sure.
redesign this.
The argument is based on the assumption that the government is us to some extent,
Yes.
and we are part of that government. And a new style of government should involve citizens, and that's why we make a distinction between three types of actors, but civil society actors and governments are in charge of society.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's so important to put your finger on that, like, okay, this is what we can do. It's also, people call my book very optimistic in the end, and of course I think we have to be optimistic. If we wouldn't empower people to to give them power to actually rearrange and reorganize their own platform society that they want to live in, then it's going to be done for them. And
Yes.
I think they need to be part of that change.
Okay. Yes. So optimism is a good place to
I think
to
optimism
end
is the way to
and I
proceed.
think we're up with our time. Thank you very much for speaking with
You're
me
very
today.
welcome.
I enjoyed reading the book very much and always talking
Thank
to you
you.
about these issues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.